I'm John Atack, for anybody who doesn't know that. And this is my honoured guest, Dr. Steven Moffic. Hi, Steve.
Hi, everybody, and John, of course. Good to see
John.
you again.
Yeah,
Couple,
it is. It's such a pleasure, isn't it? It's such good
yeah,
fun.
couple,
If,
couple of months later from last time. Yeah,
yeah, and it feels like cheating, enjoying work so much, but there you go. It's,
yeah, yeah. Kind of
I
a
think,
conversation. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah. So one of the best things in the world, I think, being able to sit and chew the fat with one's friends. So, yes, I put it to you that you are a social psychiatrist, and we've talked about that.
yes.
And um, you have won many awards for this, and another one, I think, since we last spoke. You just keep racking them up. Have you got a kind of shelf with?
No, please, no.
But um, so I what I brought up was three ideas that kind of overlap in my mind. One of them is what is these days called mass sociogenic illness. It generally referred to as mass hysteria for a while. I encountered it through the work of Dr. Kapta Akhmedova, and she briefly made the news some time ago when she was in Chechnya, and there were outbreaks at both ends of Chechnya in schools of these terrible, what the people experiencing them believed were poisonings. They thought the Russians had poisoned them. And they were having fits, they were projectile vomiting, they were hospitalized. There were about 100 young people involved in this. And I read about this story and I wrote something about it. And my editor said, "Oh, that's a fascinating story, but you don't know enough." So, which often happens, sadly.
Yeah,
And he said, "Why don't you get in touch with them?" I'm sort of, how do I get in touch with a professor of psychology in Chechnya? So I looked her up, and she'd also graduated from an American university, and she still had an email address. And within 24 hours, she came back to me. And over several weeks, we worked out, this thing, and it became, it's within my book, Opening Our Minds, that story. But she said that a Russian psychiatrist had come out and she'd had to traipse behind him and keep her mouth shut. And he said, "Oh, they're all suffering from hysteria." And she was like, "You can't do that. Hysteria is an individual diagnosis." And she, in fact, spent 2 years using cognitive therapy to bring all of them out of hospital. And she had to do it one by one because there wasn't another cognitive therapist in Chechnya. So they had entered into a group delusion, which was so powerful that they were projectile vomiting and having fits and this sort of thing. We then have the condition that's called folie à plusiers. And I think folie à deux is perhaps a more known expression where two people
yeah,
live in a fantasy world together. But it can
yeah,
happen to a group. And this is certainly what happens in authoritarian cult groups. That they believe certain crazy things. We look at something like, Heaven's Gate, where the men all castrated themselves as part of their folie à plusieurs, as part of their belief. And then we have this idea, which I first encountered from Bandy Lee, who you know and have worked with, about a sort of contagion of psychosis that spreading out into a group of people. So I've been a long preamble, but now the floor is yours, Dr. Steve.
yeah. It's a important and interesting subject, And I was telling you that today's 9/01, 9/11/01 anniversary, and we could probably think about this subject in relationship to that, which
Yeah, Mohammed Atta and co. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, I haven't actually thought of that, and I just wrote an article about the anniversary, so I may have left something important out. But yeah, what you're bringing up, we hear about stuff like that on and off, sort of this mass hysteria. You hear about it often on a lot with teenagers, that something will happen in a school and all of a sudden all the teenagers are upset in a certain way and overreacting. You see them in history of tulips and
Yeah,
how
the black
popular
tulip.
they
Yeah.
became, and people just bought and bought. And then, you see it in political movements too, I think. I'm not going to get in deep trouble by particularly focusing on one of them, but we do see that in history. And you're an expert in cults, and it's sort of like, well, is this the same thing as cults? Is it different in any way? It seems to be more of an acute phenomena that can be dealt with or dies out on its own, depending on circumstances, whereas being part of a cult doesn't. And you're part of an organization that has a leader, and the leader has these cemented psychological, emotional bonds. That's not necessarily the case with this brief mass psychosis.
No.
I think so. That might be one important difference. But and I think that kind of mass psychosis phenomena is frightening in a way, because it can seemingly come out of the blue, and obviously cause some damage. And it hasn't been, I don't think, well studied. I mean, even the term mass hysteria, hysteria used to be a official psychiatric diagnosis, and was certainly talked about a lot by Freud and his colleagues in those areas, but it's no longer an official psychiatric diagnosis anyways. I think part of it was viewed as being anti-women, because it mainly got applied to women. And
hysteros means the womb. So it's the woman's condition, hysteria. Yeah. Whoops.
Exactly. So in a way, it's probably better not to use that term, with this kind of group either. But yeah, it's potentially important. And I think it fits in this whole social area where I view that we have a variety of social psychopathologies. Simply that includes cults, racism, anti-Semitism, burnout, and so forth. And we could probably add this on too, and it's an area that doesn't have an organized way of conceptualizing it. I mean, I'm not exactly suggesting we develop a classification of social psychopathologies, though I will suggest we should. But I think that would be an uphill battle. But we don't have a good conception of what's happening in the social sphere that is generally harmful to lots of people, and even harmful to the perpetrators themselves. And what you brought up might be another one of the classifications that would fit if that was ever conceptualized and brought to some more general study and understanding.
I think the degree of fervor that is incited becomes very significant. So I don't think I've ever been particularly fervent. That's probably my failing. So when I was involved in Scientology and I realized that Ron Hubbard had told lies, I was done. It was a matter of time. It took a few months, but then I found that when I talked with fellow believers, that they had all sorts of justifications and excuses not to admit the evidence. The cognitive dissonance was too strong for them. And that became a lifelong fascination. That's 40 years ago. That, how much are we responsive to reasoning, and how much are we basing, our activities on feelings of knowing, on the sense of certainty, on the certainty that our belief is true. And when we look at Mohammed Atta and the other 18 members of the Al-Qaeda team that, performed the 9/11 massacre, then we find, that it's not quite what people expect. They expect kind of unwashed, uneducated, weak-willed people who've been pushed into doing this. And of course, when we look at the lives of that group of people, they were largely European educated. They had degrees and even master's degrees from Western Europe universities. They had not gone to madrasas. Not one of them was trained in a madrasa. They were alienated. They were born into a world that didn't accept them. So, and in most of the cases I've looked at, and I looked at far too many, they tend to be second generation immigrants whose parents are not fervent Muslims, and they go against their own parents by saying, well, you've abandoned the faith. And they then come to believe certain things which are interpretations of the Quran. And the Quran makes it very clear that suicide is not permitted and that the murder of innocents is not permitted. There are surahs that deal with those 2 points. Those are pushed aside within the Wahhabi or Salafi belief, which is that tiny portion, about 0.5% of Muslims belong to this, but it gave us Al-Qaeda and it gave us ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever we call it. And people, as Voltaire didn't actually say, people who believe absurdities will tend to commit atrocities. He says something far more complicated than that, but I'm with that thought, that if you can get a group of people to believe that by murdering thousands of civilians, they will immediately on their death enter paradise, where they'll be gifted with, I think you get 70 houris each, and of course in their heaven you're allowed to do what you like with the houris. I think this bizarre notion that this fantasy that then propels people to commit these actions. I mean, to put the balance in, when the Crusades began at the very end of the 11th century, a pope declared that if you had the intention to kill a Muslim, then even if you didn't manage to do it, you would go to heaven with that intention, which kind of, the thou shalt not kill commandment was pushed aside. It was, well, thou shalt not kill people who believe something you don't believe, and humanity is lost. We dehumanize the targets. I'm sure that Muhammad Atta and his friends never sat down and thought about the children who would be left behind without parents. Their intention was to create a war, to achieve exactly what they did achieve, which was to make the non-Muslim community hate the Muslim community, not focus on those militant Salafis or Wahhabis who had performed this act, but to generalize it, hate Muslims, persecute Muslims, which would then cause a pushback against Christendom and the Western world. And that was tremendously successful. When on 9/11 there were just less than 480 people involved in the 4 groups that were lumped together as Al-Qaeda. Within 2 years, there were 35,000 people in Al-Qaeda. So as a military strategy, it was incredibly effective, arousing hatred in Westerners. I believe the majority of the Arab population of the US at that time were Christian, but they were most certainly persecuted as a consequence of being identified with this group of 19 people. So that again is I hadn't really thought about this, but that again creates a folie à plusiers, a madness of the group in the opponents, and so people start, rather than seeking reconciliation, they want revenge, and which led us to the Afghan war with about 150,000 deaths, and the invasion of Iraq with about 750,000 deaths, as acts of revenge, rather than, looking to some way to settle this madness and to isolate the actual criminals, to deal with the people who are actually doing it, rather than saying, well, you've got dark skin, therefore, or, so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of revenge, the most common cause that we think of from the psychiatric side is humiliation. And people feel humiliated. Doesn't matter how smart you are. If you feel humiliated, you tend to want to have some sort of revenge. And so often that's behind these kinds of movements. It probably was a major factor in the Nazis becoming so powerful, because Germany
Absolutely.
was humiliated after World War I because of the terms and how their economy was growing between the wars, or not, and then falling apart. And Hitler promised, things would be better. It's But it's from the United States point of view. What you wonder, going back to that time you mentioned, is how well did we understand that this could happen, and that there were some danger signs? I don't think we understood that very well. I don't think usually our government cross-cultural understanding has been suspect, and yes, there was a psychiatrist involved, a great psychiatrist named Gerald
World
Post,
Post. Yeah.
but his focus was on individual leaders, not necessarily the social phenomena that you're mentioning that's associated with them. So he got part of the equation, but not the social part of about that. So it's an important lesson to take out of 9/11/01. Why did we miss this potentially happening? But the phenomena is very widespread, as I was trying to mention early on, and it goes into mundane situations. Well, I wouldn't call them mundane. That's wrong. It's not even mundane for me. In America, the National Football League just started yesterday, and there was a book many years ago called "The Madness of Sports," and I think you have that in your soccer games, your football games.
I don't know what you're talking about, Stephen. We're always
Yeah,
very polite and friendly at soccer games.
and it's groups of fans getting together, and if they feel their team is cheated, they can have riots in the stands. But it's those social bonds that are so close and kind of making up in part for deficits, so that if your team wins, you feel better, and you feel like you're part of a group. You're not lonely or alienated or isolated. And so there's much good that could come out of that, potentially, those bonds that bring sports fans together. But I even think probably the danger of that is even erupting in women's sports too. It's just a natural side effect we don't want to happen in sports. But I think it's just an indicating on how vulnerable we are as a people for going awry socially in groups that can be as destructive as they can be constructive. And it's so important to watch for that and find ways to either prevent this kind of stuff, or head it off, or at least recognize when it's happening. And you get this whole world nowadays of disinformation and cultish stuff on the internet, and how do you break through that, to again head off dangerous things from happening. And after the 9/11 bombing, you're absolutely right that Muslims were blamed. Certainly President Trump mentioned that, but also pulled into the picture was Jews. There was a conspiracy theory, as there always is,
As there
about
always is.
Jews causing that, with zero evidence, and still zero evidence. But it's a way of putting the blame on somebody else, and getting people together on something that they'll readily believe, because Jews have always been blamed, so they can be blamed for this too. So it wasn't even only Islamophobia, it was anti-Semitism at the time, so.
Yeah, and general sort of anti-Arab feeling. I mean, of course, an idea that we take from Judaism is the idea of the scapegoat, the idea that you can write the sins of the community and pin them onto a goat and send the goat out into the wilderness to take your sins. And the poor goat, what's the goat ever done? This is so wrong. And unfortunately, absolutely, as you say, the Jews for many centuries have been scapegoated, and whenever anything goes wrong, so looking at Germany, that by January 33, when Hitler came to power, there were more marriages between Christians and Jews than there had ever been in the German states. Particularly in say Hamburg, that the communities were getting on. So many Jewish soldiers had fought and died, given their lives for Austrian German cause in the First World War. But here they were a target again, just as they had been during the Crusades and in pogroms in Eastern Europe. This idea of having a scapegoat, having an innocent party that you can blame so that you can express these dark feelings that we all have to some degree. This, as you say, this response to humiliation, to take revenge. There is a passage in the Bible which I believe says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." And I think it's a good idea to leave vengeance up to God. And I'm an agnostic, so
yeah,
we don't do other. Yeah. An eye for an eye, yeah, and a goat for a goat. That we call people who like sport or music fans is of itself interesting. This abbreviation of the word fanatic. And we go back to the Roman Empire and we find that the chariot races, you had the blues and the greens, these two teams. And you go, oh yeah, they're sports fans. They like chariot racing. Yeah, they were sports fans, but they elected emperors. They were the most powerful group within ancient Rome for a period of time. Just imagine if all the soccer hooligans got to elect Boris Johnson. Oh, hang on a minute. We seem to have made that mistake. This passion, the way that we come to believe things against all reason, and for me, it's very simple that if our beliefs are antisocial, if they're anti-human, if they target other people, then they're wrong. Unless we're targeting the people who are guilty, the individuals who have committed crimes against society or indeed against humanity, that's fine. But when we start to generalize, we had the 7/7 bombing in London. And afterwards, a close friend of mine said, Muslims should apologize for this. And I said, do you think Christians should apologize for Waco? Because we're in the same sort of place. We have an aberrant, the Branch Davidians, an aberrant tiny sect that have performed this. They didn't do this with the consensus of, the whole Christian faith. And that's another part of it, that kind of generalizing and blaming anybody that's, a different color, a different gender, a different anything in their beliefs and their appearance from us. And I think going forward, if we are to preserve the human environment, and we're not doing a very good job of that, that we are going to have to stop this hatred. We are going to have to stop this xenophobia, this fear of strangers. I was very interested doing some work a year or two back on when did racism come into Western society, and William Du Bois, the brilliant black anthropologist, somewhere around about 1900, coined this phrase, the religion of whiteness. And chasing it back, it would appear you can date it. In 1676, I think, you have Bacon's Rebellion in New England, as it used to be then. And the slaves, the black slaves, and the white servants, who were treated in much the same way, got together. And for months, there was a rebellion which took many lives and had to be settled by the British Army. And at that point, it was realized, and laws started to be made, that because now blacks were no longer heathens, because the Quakers and other groups had started to convert them to Christianity, they couldn't be looked down upon for not being Christians. And they also had the white servants who you didn't want them getting together with the black slaves and making trouble. So they had to have some sense of separateness, and that separateness was color. So at the end of the 17th century, and there doesn't really seem to have been that, certainly in the Roman Empire, there doesn't seem to have been any concern about color. I mean, it was a dreadful and vicious regime, but at least they weren't racist, you know. And it's become so significant in our time that in the US you have people who consider themselves to be Nazis who are actually of, say, Polish descent. And they haven't realized that Hitler had the same contempt for the Slavic peoples that he had for the Jews, and indeed wished to enslave the Slavic people. I'm told that the words Slav and slave are in fact cognate in the English language. They come from the same root. We see the opposite of that with Putin at the moment, that this is pan-Slavism. This is the other aspect, that when the Aryan Germanic ideas came up just after 1900 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the same time pan-Slavism is born. And so they have this idea that Ukraine has broken away from the greater Slavic empire and must be returned to it. You know, they tried to get Georgia back in 2008 and thankfully failed. But these are beliefs, these are ideas, you know, and genetically they don't hold up. The mixture of our genes is wild. You know, we've got, you know, bits of Genghis Khan and bits of Neanderthal in us. This idea of a pure white race or a pure black race or any pure race is a nonsense. There's one species, one race, humanity, and we're part of it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we want to get to, right? I mean, 99.9% probably plus. We have so much in common, you know, which is interesting when people want to trace their genealogy, because then you're going back to the difference, which I understand potentially helps with your identity, but it's also makes people separate, you know. And but behind all this, behind the humiliation, is this kind of inborn tendency we have to fear who and what is different, because it's really dangerous. And so to overcome that, you can respond with fight or flight. And if you get more power, the fight works out for you and you find a target to blame, and you empower your own group. And that's an inbuilt tendency, but we do have the cerebral cortex, our frontal lobes, that can overcome that if it's dealt with early on. And often, you know, with this skin color issue, I think it's complicated, and in a way the history is much longer, just like it is with Jews. But once upon a time, I did some anthropology work, kind of wondering, what was there something about dark skin color that added something on that made the prejudice more intense? Because it seemed to me, in most places in the world, the darker your skin color, the more you were discriminated against. Most everywhere, Africa, Japan, take any country.
And in the Deep South, I mean, there are blues songs. Robert Johnson sings, "I'm going to get me a brown-skinned woman," meaning I want a paler-skinned woman. So it was a prejudice that very sadly ran into that community as well. It's always fascinated me, the idea that if you have somebody who is part white, part black, that they're called black, that they become, you know, it used to be mulattoes and quadroons and octoroons and all of this, but you know, why that? And you get somebody like Saint-Georges, the incredible 18th century French composer, whose father was a nobleman and whose mother was a black slave, and he was held to be the greatest swordsman and the greatest violinist in France. Mozart lifted a whole piece for one of his violin concertos from Saint-Georges, and this poor man couldn't marry because he was a member of the nobility and a member of the slave.
Yeah.
So sad.
Yeah, and what I'm going to say, I know has been quite controversial, but I think there's an association psychologically with darkness, even in skin color, with the nighttime,
Mm,
where things are more scary for people. And
mm,
so I think that's almost automatically infused. And so when we talk about skin colors as being black and white, we're hurting the darker skinned people
mm,
and we're helping the white people because black gets associated with more negative things
mm,
psychologically, and white is the opposite. So why are we using these terms that are harmful? And then the other term, which to me is quite unhelpful, but I know sometimes I get blasted for this, is we're people of color, meaning everybody but quote whites are
mm,
people of color. Well, whites also have skin color. So why are you drawing that distinction? Because
mm,
ultimately, we want to get where you mentioned. We want to be a people of a human race more connected. I actually feel we have to go towards having a main part of our identification, almost the last thing we say about our identity, be something that refers to everybody. Like, I'm a Jewish American earthling. The last term is something that identifies you with everybody.
mm,
Um, and we have to see that link, um, which could soften, hopefully, these distinctions and separation based on fear and power. Of course, we have a long way to go to try to do that, but I think that's the ultimate goal, to find ways where we feel connected with everybody.
mm.
Um, the last comment I want to make in reference to what you said is, when is forgiveness appropriate to mm, soften the wounds so that we don't keep doing the same thing over and over in revenge? And forgiveness is difficult. If you've been hurt real bad, it actually ends up probably hurting you more mentally and physically than it does
Mm.
the person who's hurt you. But nevertheless, um, it prevents resolution of conflicts. And going back to World War II in a way, the ending for Germany after World War II was so much different than World War One. And maybe I wouldn't say the Western ally powers forgave Germany. That's probably too strong, but they made sure that they could recover economically.
Mm.
Um,
The
I mean,
Marshall Plan.
and it worked. Even Israel and Germany have become partners afterwards. So you don't have to keep blaming the other over history. There's ways to break that up. That comes down to individuals in the intergenerational transmission of trauma. But there's social transmission intergenerationally of trauma also. And
Mm.
so we have to keep that in mind and how to break that kind of transmission.
Absolutely. I was very moved by an account of a meeting in Northern Ireland. There's a woman who's she was a member of the IRA, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, I should say, and she had been involved with a, a group that had captured a policeman, tied him into the driving seat of a van, put explosives in the van, and then sent the van off, and it had blown up. Now, she was not
Mm.
directly involved in that particular action, but she was a part of the group that did it.
Mhm.
And it changed her mind. She went, what a truly despicable thing to do. And she left the IRA. Years later, the Truth and Reconciliation movement arrived, which I don't think was very successful in South Africa, where I believe it began. I think that's a mess. But in
Marshall.
Northern Ireland, I think it was very helpful, and it was largely the work of women saying, we don't want to do this anymore. This is crazy. And this woman found herself at a meeting with the wife of the man who'd been killed. And she was seized with panic that here she was in the room with this woman who she'd had something to do with wronging so badly. And to her amazement, the woman embraced her. And that's the only way forward. If we keep fighting, if we keep saying, well, your granddad hurt my granddad, then we're never going to get anywhere. And there's this current movement which does concern me, where called white guilt, and this idea that we are, as white people, we are the beneficiaries of centuries of oppression. Now, in some cases, this is absolutely true. Some of the richest families in the world. There's a broadcaster called Laura Trevelyan, who works for the BBC, and she and her family, a very wealthy family, the Trevelyans, have given, I think it was £100,000 to one of the West Indian islands because they held slaves there. And first thing I'm going to say is that's a tiny amount of money. That's not enough to buy a house in this country. So, but the second thing is, to the extent that their wealth is based upon slavery, they should be giving up all of it. If they really want to be honorable, they should be saying, we'll give all of this up. But who are you giving it to? And who's descended from whom? You know, we have this awful conundrum that because the slave masters kept the house slaves, right, and they would fall pregnant, but the field slaves would not, because they were malnourished to such an extent that they couldn't bear children. So the population was always being swelled by people who had descended from the very worst slavers. You know, it's worth saying that in this country, 400,000 people in the 18th century signed petitions to end slavery. It was not a popular thought. It's also fair to say, I looked into this in some detail. There's a historian called Linda Holly, I think, who wrote a book called Captives, where she talks about Europeans who were held slaves, particularly British people who were held slaves within, and there were about 1 million white slaves held in Africa, particularly, you know, among Muslim communities. Oh dear, probably shouldn't have said that. Let's get our revenge on them. But the thing that really struck me was when she talked about the conditions of British troops in India, and the horrible colonial Raj and all of that, that it was against military law to flog sepoys who were native soldiers. That you couldn't give them a flogging, but British soldiers would be flogged to death. This happened, and so the horrible point is that those in power have mistreated those who do not have power throughout human history. And to say that is white power, you know, or black power, and then to get into the whole confusion of nobody white was able to go inland in Africa to take slaves until quinine had been stolen from the Spanish, which I think 1848, somewhere around there, suddenly the anti-malarial drug is available. But malaria was so dangerous that Europeans didn't go to the interior of Africa. So all of the slaves were brought to them by African tribes who'd captured them and would sell them. Yeah. And you have, you know, the Viceroy of Ouida by Bruce Chatwin, or a Cobra Verde by Werner Herzog, which are about this dreadful period in history. So my formulation is that the people that we need to be careful of are the people who are inciting hatred for whatever reason. The people are saying, we are better than you because our ancestors suffered, or we should be superior to you. That superiority, I think, should be based on merit and on compassion, rather than like being Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or Elon Musk and having a lot of money and power. We should look to people, you know, and this is within the Jewish, the Muslim, the Christian, the Buddhist, the Jain, whatever tradition you like. We should look to people who are compassionate and decent and love humanity as our heroes, rather than people who foment hatred, hate mongers.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. Although I would put a qualification on how you're using hate or hatred.
Mm.
I, I think there are situations where hate or hatred is appropriate. It's
I
what
would call that indignity, and I think it's a different quality. But I think, you know, there is, one can be righteously upset about 9/11. That's for sure. If that becomes hatred
well,
rather
it's what
than
you do. It's what you
indignation,
do
I
with
think it's
the
different.
hatred.
Yeah.
It's what you do with the
Mm.
hatred, so the hatred can be a clue to you about the intensity of your feeling. And what are you going to do with that? So let's say I hate Hitler, even though he's long gone, but I
Mm.
hate him.
Mm.
What am I going to do with that? If I want to follow what you just said, I'm going to want to work to prevent any such Holocaust, mass genocide tendencies, and so forth, that I can.
Mm.
And I do try to do that. I don't like to talk about my awards, but since you mentioned at the beginning, the award I'm getting is the Abraham Halpern Humanitarian Award.
Mm.
And I'm going to have to do a lecture to receive it. And the title I've come up with so far is pretty awkward, but it'll illustrate what I'm getting at. Is this an impossible dream? The social integration of humanism, religion, and spirituality.
Mm.
And so what I'm getting at there, well, first of all, it's a play off on the Impossible Dream from the Man of La Mancha play.
Yeah,
You
there's
know,
always a song involved with your lectures, isn't there, Stephen? To dream the impossible dream.
yeah. And two reasons I picked that.
It's
One,
so
it
Rusty
has,
can sing it. I know.
you got it. That's one of them. And then it lists all these things he wants to overcome. And of course, he's depicted as delusional in the play, and sometimes I am too. It's like, can we overcome these social problems? And religions can cause the same kind of discrimination, and so could atheists and so forth. There's an essence on the bottom of this that, and you've mentioned it, that we have to reinforce and look for these people wherever we can to make them our leaders and our joiners, because we have this human tendency. It's part of human nature to end up doing these horrendous things. And unless we realize that, accept it, and work to change that in how we raise kids and how we work politically, we've got so many better ways to destroy ourselves nowadays, ranging from climate change to nuclear bombs, biological pollution, or toxins. We can much more easily do that. And if we don't, what's the author's name? Steven Pinker. If we don't try to pull more on our better angels, as his book describes, and there's a movement in the United States called the Braver Angels that tries to bring people together who have different political points of view so they can see what more they have in common rather than difference. And if we don't go that route, humanity's in grave danger nowadays. So, but I do think we can get more toward our better angels, our better selves. It's actually the whole point of the Jewish high holy days that are coming up soon. I guess those are in the back of my mind too. One of the things you're supposed to do as a person during Yom Kippur to starting with Rosh Hashanah, actually, you're just supposed to think about how you can turn toward your better self. What did you do wrong the past year, and how are you going to not only correct that, but move to a better, higher way of being a person? And I think that's everybody's challenge.
I agree with you, and I think sadly we've become unusual in that we are two people who do believe that there are enough tools in the toolkit to solve the problem. I think so many people have lost hope. Talking with people who are dealing with cults, the feeling throughout the 40 years that I've been involved with this, most people is, you know, we're not going to stop it. We're managing to deal with about 1% of the problem, and the problem has grown worse and worse. That
Yeah.
you know, this terrible random word cult, meaning a group that is devoted to a leader and or a doctrine. That's all it means. But the
Yeah.
we society has always been a set of interlocking cults, and occasionally somebody comes up with a good and useful idea, and that you can have a
Yeah,
cult that follows that useful idea, and away we go. But the more extreme behaviors where one had expected, probably from when I was coming to adulthood in the late 60s, early 70s, I think there really was an aspiration towards a society without war. And it wasn't just in the hippie movement that was happening. And I think we've seen that devastated, that by so much. So Vietnam seemed to be the end of something dreadful, but it didn't stop, and the balance shifted, and in fact in around about 1900, 80% of the casualties of war were soldiers. By 2000, 80% of the casualties of war were civilians. And the old medieval form of warfare, which was, the soldiers go and fight during the fighting campaign, which is not winter, of course. There were sort of rules. There were rules that were set down. Now we're seeing the Russians destroying the crops in Ukraine, and this is going to lead to famine in the coming year. And we're in this bizarre state where this is World War III, whether we like it or not. There's a proxy war being fought by NATO, and how to stop that from escalating is was extraordinarily difficult. But I agree with you that by focusing on how to improve ourselves, Philip Zimbardo, the great Philip Zimbardo, launched the Heroic Imagination Project, which I'll recommend to anybody who's watching, which is to bring out the hero in yourself, to bring out what's best in you.
Yeah, he's a great example, because there's something that preceded that project, which you probably know about. And I could connect this to myself if I remember to do so. But his earlier project had to do, it's called the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Yeah, 1971, yeah.
Yeah, so, he brought Stanford students together, talk about smart people.
They weren't.
I'm
going to stop you. They weren't Stanford students. They were actually recruited from a pool of university students with the idea that no two of them would know each other before they went in. So it was done in the basement at Stanford University. But sorry, I am deeply steeped in this particular thing because it's so relevant to the work I do.
Yeah, I won't say too much about it because the guard group then started to harass the students in prison, and Zimbardo sort of piled onto that, and it took his fiance, Maslach, I forget her first name, who's been a scholar.
Yeah,
she's been the main scholar about burnout over the years. Anyway, she said, if we're going to marry, you have to stop this experiment. What you're doing is horrible. And it was.
On the sixth day. It was on the sixth day.
Point. Yeah, he proved a point, but the point was already proven before that. We already knew that under authority, people can deteriorate in their values, So I think in a way that led him in this direction of being a better angel with the heroic
imagination
project,
yeah
that you mentioned. which is great. And one of the good aspects about that, I think it goes beyond just becoming a hero in a crisis like the first responders in 9/11. Probably all of them could be said to be heroes, but
Absolutely.
we need that more in everyday life, that people will take chances, and chances that might hurt themselves in some ways, to do what's necessary and right, ranging from whistleblowers to raising your hand at a meeting and saying this doesn't sound right, and so forth. So
Mm.
it's a beautiful recovery on his part, a turn for the better that I just brought up. So, he's a great model for going wrong but coming out right, and that's something all of us should try to think about.
Mm.
The connection that came to my own mind about myself, because you mentioned the Vietnam War and so forth, is I was in medical school at the time of the Vietnam War. And I think by the second year, all of us started to think, what's going to happen when we finish medical school? Are we going to be drafted into the Army right out of medical school, or what?
Mm.
And lots of us started to panic, as did I. I did not want to be drafted into the Army at the time, not because a war was going on, but because I didn't think my general medical knowledge was going to be adequate to be put in a situation like that. So there were two other choices. One was I could become a conscientious objector. My father was a lawyer. I asked him about it. He said, "Yeah, I can help you get out." And the third was this plan called the Berry Plan. You could apply for it in any of the armed forces division, and if you got in, you didn't have to serve until you finished your specialty training, mine being psychiatry, and then you would owe the Army 2 years after that. And so as time went on, I said, okay, I'll do the CO, the conscientious objector. And it got closer to midnight. And when you had to mail this in, I said, I can't do this. I'm not against all wars. I'm against this war. Like I told you about hate, I think sometimes wars have to be appropriate because we're not ready to do without them. It's a question of which ones are necessary and what's your goal with the war. So I put in for the Berry Plan. I got in. I owed the Army 2 years. It was a revelatory sort of experience, a great learning experience. And I actually have ended up being proud I served in the Army. But the moral and ethical decision to get there was not easy. And I think it's, for me at least, it's not so simple. It's because of human nature again. It's unrealistic to say in the near future we're not going to have any more wars. It's just not going to happen. But we can go toward having less wars. I mean, in the situation in Ukraine that you mentioned, it seemed pretty obvious to me, even though I don't follow things as well as you do. But when the Russians massed on the border of Ukraine for months, they weren't there for fun. They were waiting to see what the United States and the West was going to do. I think they could have been headed off and we would have never had this war. What did we miss then? That we've got to learn out of this, that maybe even could be applied now. So because we're in this really kind of stagnation now, I think the United States and its allies can turn the corner with this if they want to provide more weapons that'll help Ukraine. But then there's political issues and fear of nuclear weapons being used and so forth. But I think this all could have been prevented, So
I think so too, and I think it could be brought to an end now. But Antony Blinken this week said that the US has spent $43 billion in Ukraine so far. That's an incredible amount of money that could have been used to help people, that could have been used to mend corrupt justice systems, to bring education to the world, to make hospitals, to do all sorts of lovely things. And instead it's being poured into this conflict, which
Yeah.
has actually been going on since 2014, with NATO
Yeah.
not wanting to
That's
be
right.
involved. Um,
Yeah.
I've come to the conclusion and that this is a war that can't be won. This is that there will be stalemate, because Russia is hugely rich and hugely powerful. And I
Yes.
think within a week of launching the war on the 24th of February last year, Putin was talking about using nuclear weapons. And if, short-range
Yeah.
nuclear weapons are deployed there, then what's the response to that? How do you do anything to that? And as Putin is,
Yeah.
it's something you see in occasionally, thankfully not always, but in so-called cult groups, the Jim Jones effect. When the leader knows, or Marshall Applewhite, when the leader knows that they are nearing death, they decide to take the group with them. And Hitler, a month before the end of the war, Admiral Dönitz and Goering both went to Hitler and said, "We've got to stop." And Hitler said, "The German people deserve to die." And 1 million lives were lost in that last month.
Yeah.
So I fear that Putin understands that if he doesn't win, or come to a draw, that he personally will end up like Mussolini, hanging from a lamppost. So he's got a lot invested in this. I think that the back door is actually China. I think that by resolving trade deals with China, that the only person that Putin will listen to is Xi Jinping. And there are moves in that direction at the moment, but
some hope there.
Yeah. I mean, what on earth would happen if Trump were re-elected? Because I imagine he would stop any aid to Ukraine and
Probably
up the saber rattling with China. Though, having said that, I was criticised roundly by a Trump supporter the other week in the comments, and because I've never said anything nice about Donald Trump. I don't like his hair. It's true, so I can't say anything nice about
I'll
that.
say something nice.
Go
He
on,
at least
do it.
got vaccination process started in the United States. Late, but he got it started.
Yeah. So, despite what he'd said against it, and despite having had Andrew Wakefield, the great anti-vaxxer, actually at his inauguration party, and said what a great man he was. But I think he was also right to focus on the China problem as an economic problem. I think that was sensible to say, we've let them get away with this for so long, and we should be boosting our own manufacturing. I've long thought that rather than having special economic zones where you have pretty much slaves working all around the Pacific Rim, that we should use robotization in our own countries to build things. And, and make offers that are like, we won't trade with you unless you pay your workers the same as we pay ours, rather than this constant, it's so like the 19th century with the abuse of China, which is, I think most Westerners don't realize that for the Chinese, as for the North Koreans, their perception of the West is rather different than our own, sense of ourselves. That, the two opium wars, the Boxer Rebellion, that the Chinese were tremendously oppressed by the European nations, and a little bit at the end by the US. And that resentment, that hatred carries on.
Yeah, and they were humiliated by the West back in history too. Yeah, you're talking about an important way to bring people together, which is economics, from individuals on up to groups. You have to have some economic security. It's one of our basic needs. So yeah, you want to play upon that because that could certainly help bring nations together rather than separate. And certainly, I think with our knowledge of technology and growing food nowadays, there's enough for everybody in the world.
Yeah.
But distribution and helping the countries and people that are too far behind that's the challenge, but we
Mm.
could do it.
Yeah, and if we weren't spending the money on, the $1 trillion that was spent on Iraq to
For sure.
achieve nothing, you know.
Yeah, United States has this tendency to keep fighting in wars that are unwinnable or they're
Mm.
not winning. You got Vietnam, you got Afghanistan, and now maybe, hopefully not, Ukraine and Russia. I mean,
Mm.
we just somehow we don't know how to get out of these situations or prevent ourselves from getting into them in the first place. But we don't have a track record of very well getting out of these sort of conundrums between countries.
Yeah. So I think we've probably solved most of the world's problems in the last hour.
Well, I got a solution, another solution,
Ah,
because
please.
before we stop, I don't know if you mentioned this before we got on the air or afterwards, which is jazz and John Coltrane. So,
Before, yeah.
so my favorite recording of John Coltrane, the black saxophonist in the United States, is A Love Supreme.
Mm.
And that's what we're trying to drive toward. How do you love other people? And but it's jazz in general that I want to mention. If there's anything that has been able to bring diverse people together in the United States, but in the world, even in Russia, it's jazz.
Mm.
And it's a model of people working together. It's music where you have some structure, but a lot of improvisation is needed. Leadership can shift from group to group. And it's been a major success of Black Americans in the United States, with involvement as time went on with other cultural groups, and then it spread around the world. It was so threatening actually to Russia at a certain time that it was prohibited, but
And
there was
in
a
Nazi Germany.
the Chinese loved it in the 1930s, not
Mm.
anymore, but they loved it then. And really, you could almost pick every country in the world. So I think, and music itself is a healing force. So,
Absolutely.
there are ways to bring people together of diverse backgrounds and power, and jazz is one. And I'd suggest we keep that in mind. It's not an easy music necessarily to quickly like, because it's complex. At least some of it's complex, but there are easy ways to get into it, like say the music of Dave Brubeck or
Mm.
Louis Armstrong. And I'd recommend these great jazz musicians to everybody.
Mm.
And if you could ever see jazz live, you could just see how people play off of one another and trust one another, and love one another. So that's my recommendation for today.
I think that's really, really significant. And let's point to a specific John Coltrane track, which is called Resolution, which is what we're looking for, which is a wonderful piece. In Ken Burns Jazz, there's one of the white jazz critics says, I was brought up in the Deep South to believe that Black people were subhuman. And then one night I went into a club and I saw Louis Armstrong. And I realized this was the first time I'd actually seen a genius. And my whole view of the world changed. Armstrong was asked at one point, it was said to him at one point, this is a black music. And he looked at the person interviewing, he said, well, what about Bix Beiderbecke? It's like,
Yeah.
And from
Exactly.
quite early on, jazz became a Jewish music as well. How much klezmer had to do with it, I don't know. But Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, so many, and so many of the standards, of course, of jazz were written by Jews. In fact, Cole Porter was about the only major writer of standards who wasn't Jewish, with Gershwin and Irving Berlin and on and on. So I agree with you.
Look how Louis Armstrong progressed in making the music attractive to everybody. He started with really complex playing, and then over time he got his music to be more popular. He sang from Hello Dolly. What a Wonderful World was a hit song for him. He found ways to popularize it. Got criticized for that, like you're being too white, you're being honky by popularizing music. No, he brought people together. He could still play as complex as he wanted to at time, but he's another great model of how you can progress to helping people more generally and not having to use all your scholarly knowledge to do so. You keep that scholarly knowledge, but you apply it, you apply it more broadly, to the world.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, in the 50s, the biggest selling jazz albums were the 3 albums that Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald made together. And I cannot recommend them too highly. The relaxed and friendly atmosphere that Armstrong was able to generate. Hello, Dolly is really funny because they were making an album and they were short by a few minutes. And somebody said, oh, here, play this. And they recorded Hello, Dolly. They went off on tour and it became a massive international hit. And they didn't know how to play it because they just played it once in the studio. So they had to learn this song that they'd had a hit with. But yeah, I mean, he was an exuberant man. I recently, a correspondent of mine sent me this thing about Louis Armstrong advertising laxatives, and I'd never heard about this. And there you can find it. There's a picture of Armstrong sat on the privy holding up a pack of this laxative that he takes. Like, what an incredible man. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I had heard he had that challenge, but I didn't know there was a whole commercial and stuff that came out of it.
But and he comes from nowhere. He's a very poor child who's sent to reformatory when he's 8 years old for firing a gun in the street, and he works for a coal merchant at the age of 11, and they're a Jewish coal merchant, let's say, and they're so pleased with this wonderful ebullient young man. They say, look, we want to give you something, what would you like? And he went to the music shop and pointed at the cornet, and word has it that he just picked the thing up and started playing it, and from there became really the fount out of which jazz, of course, there's Buddy Bolden and other people before him, Fats Waller. But jazz comes around when he begins scat singing. He develops the whole way of singing in jazz. Instead of people going, the moon is blue and I love you, you've got this incredible thing which everybody will impersonate. Lady Day, of course, manages to get his trumpet tones and sing those. Just amazing stuff. So yeah, rush out and buy those things and make the world a better place. That's what we think.
Yes.
Great. Amen. Thank you. Thanks so much, Stephen. We'll come back for a rematch in a couple of months' time, if that's all right.
I very much enjoy these conversations, whatever comes up.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. So, and thanks to everybody for taking time with us. And let me add a little note at the end here, which is a large part of my audience are former Scientologists for some reason. And because I've been pontificating on the subject for so many decades, probably. And of course, there is a phobia of psychiatrists in Scientology. So I just want to point out that Stephen is a very nice man, and there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
Grant, thanks so much, Stephen.
I try to be. Thank you.
Yeah, we do our best. Cheer away. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.